All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our expert panel for our Chartered College of Teaching course, all about leadership of education technology in schools. So I'm joined this evening by Abid Patel, Dominic Norrish, Emma Darcy and Neelam Parmar, and they will be introducing themselves shortly. I'm just going to give you a brief intro to the webinar tool before we get started, and then we'll be working through questions that you've already submitted for the panel. And we'll also be addressing any questions that you may like to ask the panel whilst we're live this evening. So the three spaces that you've got access to, the first space is the chat panel, which is the first panel that you can see on the right hand side. And if you're watching on a mobile device, that will appear underneath the video screen. So this space is just for you to share thoughts and reflections with one another. So we're aware that we've gathered a lot of EdTech experts here this evening, but we're also aware that a lot of you as course participants and webinar participants also have these roles within your schools and lead on EdTech within your contexts. So this chat panel is for you to share thoughts and reflections with one another, experiences. If you can add to anything that we're sharing tonight, that's always really helpful. So I'd like you to start off by just popping into the chat panel, saying who you are, where you're joining us from, and yeah, what your role is would be nice. You'll also see that we've got a questions panel. So whilst you're all introducing yourselves in the chat panel, I'll just show you the questions panel. So this panel is for questions that you'd like to ask of the expert panel this evening. So it might be something that isn't already shared on the Padlet wall already. It could just be something that occurs to you as you listen to each of our experts this evening. It could be something that's happened today at school and has made you think of something that you really need to ask some experts this evening. So pop those in there. If you see a question that you particularly like, then you can upvote those. So it means that if we get a whole load of questions, and I know we're not going to be able to answer them all, it does mean that I can pop in and sort of see which ones seem to be the highest priority amongst our participants this evening. We've also got the polls panel. Now, I'm not planning on sharing this, but it may be throughout the evening that somebody shares something and we want to have a quick vote on how you guys feel about it, in which case there may be a multiple choice question appear for you to answer in that panel. So I'm going to get started on the first question. In the meantime, if you guys go into the chat panel, do share who you are, where you're joining us from, and what your role is. That would be wonderful. All right. So our first questions to our panel this evening are fairly straightforward. We're just going to go to each member of the panel in turn, and they're going to be sharing who they are, what they do, and one key lesson they've learned about EdTech implementation over the years that they'd like to share with you all. So we're going to start with Abid.
Hi, hello everyone. So I'm Abid Patel. I'm the IT director at Leading Learning Trust, which is a small multi-academy trust in East London. I look after two schools in the trust with our IT, and I've led on the IT strategy since around about 2016, which is when we properly kicked off with the IT strategy. One key lesson that I've learned about EdTech implementation over the years is and it's something that I was talking to the CEO about today, was never take for granted what you think people may or may not know. I like to think we're all in the generation where we kind of grew up with PCs, and we just went trial and error and learned along the way how PCs worked. And I assumed a lot of the key changes I made, especially going from a Microsoft platform to a Google platform, I thought, people will just kind of get it, and that's definitely not the case. My key advice would be train your staff, train your staff, train your staff, train your staff. Oh, by the way, did I say train your staff? Definitely don't hold back on training. And you'll also find that people learn in very different ways. You'll sometimes a group training session isn't suitable for everyone, and sometimes you will need those one-to-one specialists holding hand sessions. But the more and more you do it, the more and more you'll win people over, especially with resistance to change, because change is hard. And that is the biggest challenge that I've come across in all of the implementations that I've done.
Thank you, Abid, for that insight. I'll come to you next, Dominic.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I too work for a multi-academy trust like Abid. Mine's at the other end of the scale. We're almost 80 schools now around England, one of which actually Neelam works at, and she's going to talk in a minute. I've been here for 6.5 years, leading the technology strategy. Prior to that, I was a school leader, a teacher, an IT consultant. My day-to-day is trying to make sure that technology has actual impact in schools. Sometimes that's in the way that teachers or students use it, or leaders, particularly around the administration side of things, increasingly as we get larger and larger. My key lesson that I've learned over the years is that word implementation really is the most important thing. So I've seen all sorts of technology, really quite ropey technology, being implemented very, very well, and schools making good use of it. And I've seen amazing technology not being implemented well and having zero impact. So it really doesn't matter what technology you use. Well, sorry, that's not true. That's a bit unfair. The impact of the technology you use is minor compared to how well you implement it. And I've seen that repeated time and again for multiple years.
Hi, my name is Neelam Palmer. I work as the Director of EdTech, Digital Learning and Innovation at Ashford School. I'm there as a SLT member in Digital Tech, but I'm also now with United Learning, as Dominic had said, on a part-time basis with some of the other schools. One of the key lessons I've learned about EdTech implementation is it's never easy, no matter how many times you've done it. There's always challenges. It doesn't ever end. I find that the most successful projects are those that have a strategy, that has timescales, that has deadlines attached to it, and accountability. And I think when you have all that in place, then you can really make something out of what you're going to do, rather than just have perhaps ad hoc projects or centers of excellence within your teaching community. While that is important in any case, if you really want to spread it and make it provide that biggest impact you want in your school, then having a vision, having a plan, having the support from everybody within the school, and again in our community with the UL schools on board as well, really makes that makes it drive and makes it move forward. So that's one of the key lessons I've learned.
So, first question, does the panel have any opinions on the advantages, disadvantages of implementing BYOD versus issuing each individual with a device? Okay, well, I've seen both. I suppose the problem with BYOD is exactly what you said, which is you can't specify the device. So generally speaking, you tend to kind of hobble your digital strategy a bit in that you can only use what everyone can access. And that tends to be browser-based tools generally. Now, things like Chrome, which we're using today, is increasingly powerful and you can deliver loads through it, but still not quite in the same, you don't quite get the same experience that you get with native applications on, everyone using the same device. So I think you do have a bit of a teaching and learning impact sacrifice if you're using BYOD. Certainly that's what I've seen. However, a huge advantage in that it's practically free in terms of hardware. So it's much more affordable for schools. I think the context in which it works quite well is sixth forms, particularly, where most children tend to have a device anyway, which they prefer to use, and at times even kind of resent the imposition of a school device, where poor behavior with that device is probably more manageable than it can be in a lower down the school. But yes, I think if BYOD is your only option, I think you have to think very carefully about how you're going to manage children's behaviour. Really, that's the key thing that tends to undermine these schemes. Where, with the best will in the world, eventually, if it's not tackled, people see it as a threat to good teaching and good learning, because it generally does turn into that if behaviour can't be controlled. Was that your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that whichever route you go down, you need to do your research first.
Sam's asked a question. in chat, which is, could you just say bring your own device, but the device must be able to run Office 365 or even G Suite or some other, and that would work kind of at a kind of quite utilitarian level. You could get people using spreadsheets and making presentations and typing. You'd have to have, I think, some minimum spec, which might include, a physical keyboard, for example, might be part of that, depending on how you wanted people to create work. And otherwise, some people just wouldn't be able to access all the tools. So I think we're getting closer to having just what I would call providing the infrastructure really as a school. You're providing the software, and the people, be those teachers or students, are bringing their own hardware to fit around that. I just don't think it's really quite as even a playing field as we might imagine at the moment. I really am not convinced that telephones, mobile phones, are a good form factor for use in the kind of traditional work that is often envisaged by schools when they're looking.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think you've got to think as well about your teacher training as well, in terms of if you've got lots of different devices, how does the teacher want to teach? What is it they want the devices to be used for?
I think just to add to that, from my experience, I would say you have to have a heavy pedagogical planning approach beforehand. Before you even think about implementing a BYOD model, because it would be ideal to plan out for parents and for pupils exactly what is going to be covered, so that any devices that they're bringing in would be compatible, because that might actually affect a buying decision if they don't have a device that they use currently, and if you have that clearly put in place at the start of the year or before the start of the academic year, then that would make things easier from both parties' perspective.
So I can add to this. We have an established BYOD model for sixth form at the moment at Ashford School. But to be fair, we also have a one-to-one mobile implementation starting from the prep into the senior years. So by the time the students actually enter into the sixth form, I suppose in a sense their behaviors already, they have an idea of what's expected out of them. They know the tools that we use. They've understood our ecosystem. They know what's expected out of them in a learning environment. The teachers know what they need to use with their students. So if anything, we've always thought about maybe re-engineering our sixth form design, perhaps looking and giving them a device, but there's never been a need to do that because it's been smooth. And that's probably because they've come through that program, if that makes sense. They've understood our expectations. So in a way, I think in a way, if you've set down their blueprint, what they need to do, how, what we expect from them, what they could get out of it, what their parents think about it, the whole community on its own, then it kind of helps the journey moving along.
Okay, so the next question. What opinions does the panel have on issuing teachers with mobile devices? Abid.
This has been something that I've been challenged, or I've been trying to challenge a change in mindsets at my trust, primarily from the perspective of security and two-factor authentication. I know I've experienced an awful lot where security can be as great as Fort Knox, but it's only as secure as the users who are using it. And over my time, I've seen far too many post-it notes on screens with passwords written all over them. And I think where we've had an approach where mobiles have always been seen as a time waster, so to speak. I mentioned it in a meeting that I had the other day, where I was getting some very weird looks because I was in a meeting, and you had person 1 on their MacBook, and you had person X on their Chromebook, and you had person Y taking notes on their notepad with a pen, and then you had me on my mobile. And I've always said, you know, I own an iPhone, and you know, it's a £1,200 phone. It's a supercomputer that I carry in my pocket. But why do we have that perception that if I'm standing or if I'm in a meeting and I'm doing this, then suddenly, you know, he's not paying attention and he's on Snapchat? And I think it's definitely about breaking that mindset and breaking that mold that mobile devices aren't necessarily a time waste product and device, and that they can be used in a very productive way, especially when it comes to security and two-factor authentication, because where we use G Suite for Education and we have the ability to have two-factor authentication via an authenticator app or via text message, the immediate no we get from leadership is, no, we don't want to put our staff at risk in case they take a photo of a pupil for safeguarding reasons. And I think we need to probably address that. We need to have a bit more trust in our staff, because we do all of the necessary checks before we employ them. And I think that it shouldn't necessarily be too much of a concern as it is anymore, and that the world is moving forward. You know, we work. It's something that I heard Mark Allen say was, you know, what's the first thing you touch in the morning? And it's usually your mobile device, because it's it's with us everywhere we go, and it's with us whatever we do. And I think there could be some real unlocked potential in mobile devices that we aren't really putting to good use in education.
I think it's highly context specific again. I mean, there are some schools in my trust where staff aren't allowed mobile phones out in when they're on the corridor in classrooms because of the expectations that they have of children and their use of the phones. So that's quite a strong rule in some of the schools. In other schools, that rule doesn't exist. But many schools are moving towards what I think this question drives, the provision of usually something in a tablet form for teachers to teach with and to work with. And that is seen by those teachers as it's a change in how they work, and there's obviously a kind of challenge to skills, but it's quite liberating. Firstly, not to be tied to the front of the classroom, as I think we probably all were, or I was in my teaching career, where the interactivity, you know, you had to stand at the whiteboard. So being able to teach from anywhere in the room and just cast it to the front of the room is quite powerful. But equally, not having to do your work in that room as well. I mean, I've seen so many teachers sat, you know, at this time of night in a classroom next to the wheezing PC under the desk, typing in reports, which, you know, they wouldn't need to do if they had a modern device that could access their software that they needed through a browser, and they could work from anywhere. So most of our schools are moving in this direction. We've got many schools using iPads or Microsoft Surfaces for precisely this, and phasing out their PC stock and their laptop stock. And equally, I think it does address, Abid, the point you made about, you know, GDPR and safeguarding, as if that device is managed and auditable, and all the other benefits you get from it being school owned, you do keep your staff safe in that context. So if they are taking photos of children at work for work purposes using a school device, it's you know, all above board, and no one needs to worry about the perception of that. So yes, there's a huge cost to all of this, obviously. So our schools are doing this slowly. They're doing it by looking at the kind of things they buy. So for example, when their interactive whiteboards go end of life, rather than necessarily spending £3,000 on a new whiteboard, spending £1,500 on a big dumb TV with a Miracast or a Chromecast or Apple TV in it, and spending £600 on a tablet. So spending less overall for two things that are much more powerful. Plus, you get a ready-made visualizer and all of that built into the fact that you've got a converged device in your hands. So that seems to be the slow way of doing it. and of affording it over time. Neelam or Emma, do you want to chip in?
So what I can say, when I looked at this question, I looked at it from a slightly different angle, and I thought issuing teachers, if you're going to go run down with a mobile device implementation program, then often the best situation is to have the teachers have the devices for at least a year before the students get, or at least 6 months, just so that they get used to the device, they know what they're doing with it, they understand what's expected of them, how to use the technology. And this is precisely what we did when we had our iPads in our senior school, for instance, 4 years ago, when we gave the devices to the teachers and we got them used to it. We took them on a CPD training program that I can talk to you about later on. And it made sense, and it kind of helped build the confidence and more the confidence of how to use the technology within a teaching and learning environment. I have to say, though, this time around, we've now changed our architecture a bit. We're now running with surfaces in our senior school, so every teacher and student has a surface, as Dom described. But in this period of time, but given that we were within this iPad program for 4 years, it was an expectation that this is what we do, this is how we use it. So to do without technology was impossible. And therefore, when we gave the teachers their devices, everything had to roll out very quickly. And our teachers got it over the summer period before we broke up school, and the students received it just last week. So it's a very short lead period of training them on how to use it, what's going on. But I suppose the fact is, once they've done it and they're already within that environment, it all comes quite quickly to them. So it's, from my perspective, it's very important that teachers get the devices first so that they understand the technology, the pedagogy that runs around it, what kind of apps and tools are available, how does it fit into our environment, what does that mean in changing the curriculum. So a lot of what they've done, they've set things as they expect to roll out, maybe of course with changes year after year. But when you get new devices, new technology, new systems, they need to rethink a few things. So it's really important from my perspective that teachers get it first before the students get their hand on it.
Right, I'll read it out and then I'll shut up. How would teachers handle parents who insist that their children have the right to use their mobile phones at school against school policies? Emma?
I'm just going to really quick answer on this one. If the policies and procedures are in place in the first place and they've been clearly thought through, then there's not really much of a discussion to be had. There is that, if the school has a policy, then yes, we do have parents who sometimes will come in and ask this question. We will say that it's made very clear as an expectation. It's set out in all of our sort of acceptable use policies. We are providing mobile devices for the pupils to use in the classroom. They don't need to have their mobile phones. We whenever they need to phone home, they can go to school reception. They are not disadvantaged by not having a phone. So it would very much be, I think, where you have a very difficult conversation with a parent is if you don't have the policy in place to begin with. Or if you're, and I appreciate it's very different with sort of sixth forms. I work with schools with sixth forms where yes, pupils do use mobile phones, and that's very different. But if you have a policy in school that pupils are not allowed to use their mobile phones, or they don't need to use them in the classroom, and it's very clear when and where phones are able to be used, then when that parent comes in and argues against it, you're able to say, no, this is the case. This is how we operate. It's consistency, isn't it? It's the same rule for everyone.
And let me add to that. I agree with everything that Emma has just said. In fact, that's probably what I would have said. If the policy is set in place, then you go with it. All schools have different policies and different tweaks to what they want to do. What I would say, though, is sometimes because we're a boarding school itself, some of our students have obviously time differences and they need to use their phones at different times of the day to get in touch with their families. So we do tend to work around those restrictions. And if they do need to make a call, then they, like you said, come into the reception, make that call. But for boarders, there's slightly more flexibility, of course, with restrictions around it. So it just depends on the type of school you have and the restrictions. But like you said, Emma, it's so important to have a policy in place first, because if that's not there, then that's when the discussion starts and that's when it can become very difficult.
Okay, let's hope we can disagree a bit more on this one then. how have you been able to fund the changes required to move to the cloud infrastructure of Wi-Fi devices, even if the longer term savings will be worth it? Abid, kick us off on this.
I think our schools were in a really, really bad place when I took over in 2014. We had corporate Wi-Fi at both schools, and it just simply didn't work. And it was we kind of looked at the time wasted in lessons. We were full mobile device. We were teaching computing lessons with Windows laptops, and they would take up to 25 minutes to just start up and log in because the Wi-Fi just couldn't cope. And it was a challenging strategic decision that we simply couldn't work, and our pupils were missing out far too heavily without the corporate Wi-Fi, without good robust Wi-Fi network in the first place. And with the way that the industry was going at the time, everything was just moving more and more heavily towards wireless, and we simply had to ensure that we had the right infrastructure in place to make sure that we got things working. But obviously you can't just spin money out of nowhere. That would be a wonderful world if we could. But we obviously took a look at the expenditure that we currently had, and we sat down and we developed a strategy to say that, right, if we were to put this expensive Wi-Fi system in place, then what would the longer term benefits and savings be? And one of the key things that we looked at, and one of the key things that we still look at, almost 5 years on, is printing. And just by implementing more of a mobile device approach, where our leaders are able to work untethered with mobile devices, and our teachers as well able to work untethered, we came across just challenging those mindsets that why are we printing out what we're printing, and do we need to be printing at the volumes and the levels that we are, and so cutting down on those costs was a heavy way in order to look at funding the infrastructure changes that we needed to make. But we were also in a position where we had to admit that the schools had been held back for so long, and we pushed infrastructure upgrades to next year and the following year and the year after that, and I think it's something that IT, in my experience, had always been a kind of it costs far too much money, so let's defer it another year and defer it another year. And it's only when you get the understanding that at the end of the day, most of our organizations now can't run without the IT at all. Almost everything we do lives on some form of IT, lives in the cloud or somewhere or another. And it was just understanding the importance behind the IT there, and the importance behind putting the infrastructure in, which is why we were able to secure the funding that we needed to make the infrastructure improvements we had, and it was a necessity.
Emma, what's your experience been?
Really, in the first year, we hardly spent anything at all, because spent a lot of money in the past. The impact in the
Got that? Don't worry, Emma. And I think I can echo some of what you've both said there, really, which is look very carefully at what you're currently spending. I think it's an awful lot of unexamined spend on technology. So contracts that roll over year to year for MIS add-ons, things like the example I gave before, our interactive whiteboards have stopped working, let's buy more interactive whiteboards. So there's, think very carefully about the money you commit to spend, because there's huge, as the question implies, huge advantages even in the short term from moving to the cloud in terms of people's work-life balance, having tools that are available wherever, whenever, is a good example of that. And really much harder to quantify savings and benefits like, the best example I can think of is the school that had in my group that had yet to move a key system to the cloud, was in the process of doing so, and then lost access to that key system due to a malware infection. And it took 3 days to get it back from scratch. And in those 3 days, the stress levels, the amount of work that had to be poured in at the school and from the centre, the lack of time to focus on what that school should have been focused on, which was thinking about teaching and learning, was enormous. And those are costs. Those are huge costs, not to mention the cost of people's faith in the technology and their willingness to take a risk and all these other things. So if we can get our internet connections right, he said, with a sense of irony, then the cloud offers huge advantages, I think, to schools to do the simple things right and to focus on learning, not on the tech that fits on the end of it. So definitely worth trying to afford it. And DfE got some quite good advice around this. Got a whole page, I think, and lots of resources on their website. So I would encourage everyone to engage. Unless Neelam's got something to add to this one, we should move on. She's shaking her head. What's the next question, Hannah?
I mean, I'm almost hesitant to jump in here because Dominic's doing such an exceptional job of taking over his chair there. But Hannah's just asked me to pop in and say hello, as we're clearly having a few Wi-Fi and technical issues. Obviously, that's bound to happen on a tech webinar, having worked perfectly for the 16 or so we've done already this academic year, not about technology. But thank you very much there, Dominic. What you were saying made me laugh about rolling over contracts. Apparently, there's something like £350,000 a year still being paid to AOL internet access from people who had dial-up back in the day and have never quite cancelled their contracts. So definitely a risk in schools as well. So thank you. So the next question, I'll probably just jump to one or two of you for these next couple of questions because we've got a few left that people had asked, and I know that people will be wanting to see the recording and see the answers. So Neelam, shall we hop to you first to say, how do you make time for effective CPD within your school timetable?
Okay, so this is quite an interesting one. I work across two sites. So there's the primary years and then there's the seniors. And the CPD program is very different across both of these sectors. Within the primary years, the teachers are very busy. They don't tend to have very much time. They're working on like 5-minute schedules. They're running around everywhere. So in order to actually get any sort of effective CPD within that school, we timetable them. We give them 20-minute slots within the timetable where I met up with a group of teachers, and then I would proactively offer CPD either in a group or one-to-one sometimes. And then as time went on, we had more sort of virtual webinars, which I could offer and move on. We still do that, probably not as much now because they're fairly confident with the use of technology. In the senior school, however, it's slightly different. So instead of trying to timetable it, we're working more on a department level. I found that it's more effective in that sense, and I could cater to their needs in a better way. But what's been really great this time around is obviously, as we say over and over again, have your digital team on the ground. There's 2 really good digital leaders in the primary school, and again, I'm talking about teachers, you're not students, and then 5 of us in the senior school. So if I'm not around, which now tends to happen quite a bit because we're moving around school so much, there are key leaders in each site who can then support the teachers when they need them. I think initially it's very, you want to have one person on board, and I was there and I could offer a lot. But as time moves on and the teachers get more competent, they are moving at different paces. And so, they if you have people on board within these schools, they can start leaning on each other, and that made a huge difference. I think that what's really important among all of this is that you've got the deputy academics or anyone who's working with timetable, anybody who's supporting this from the SLT point of view to really want this to happen as well. So, the only way you're going to get CPD to run in your school is to get a lot of support from the top and SLT.
That's great. Thank you. I think that was a very comprehensive answer. So we'll go on to the next question, if that's okay. If anyone has a burning response they want to give, I'm sure we'll have a chance. So this question is about the best process or approach to understand whether things are actually effective for teaching or learning. I think one of the challenges we can have with technology is that when you've spent a huge amount of money, you really, really want it to work. And sometimes you're strongly want to emphasize, oh, yes, it definitely has worked, even if there's not a great deal of evidence for that. So understanding how we can measure that is really important. Dominic, your name is not on this slide, but I'm going to come to you anyway, just to surprise you a bit. It'd be interesting from your sense of working with a group of schools. Does that help you to understand sort of the differences between schools who are making use of technology and those who aren't? Does that help you to be able to see whether things are effective or not? Do you find benefits from that?
It's hard to say if we find benefits from it. I think we pursue it, constantly trying to understand what's effective and what isn't and what impact it's having. And the closest we get is kind of understanding sentiment from teachers and pupils and how that changes over time, which isn't a very scientific measure, but certainly is reality for those individuals. However, when you mention processes and trying to hone those across a number of schools, I think that is something that we're very keen in pursuing, because there's so much ineffectiveness built into how individual schools just have done things for a long time. So we're always looking to try and find a better way of doing things and understanding where it's working brilliantly. So I don't think anyone in a MAT knows the answer to this, but someone in a school will be doing something brilliantly in every process that a school has to do. So trying to identify that, learn from it and spread it out is certainly a big part of our effort. And often that is a digital process. Often it's built into the way that we use our MISs or the way that we use SharePoint or whatever the tool is, that can create something a lot better than the old manual way that people have been doing things.
Yeah, I think something interesting here is that you're all talking obviously about very different systems, but yet managing to make them work, which echoes your point earlier, Dominic, that actually that the technology that you choose is so much less important in the overall factor than how you support your staff and your approaches there. That's great. Right, we'll hop on to the next question if that's okay. Great. This idea of involving stakeholders in your strategy to increase buy-in. I know this is something you've done a lot of work around, Neelam, so I'm just going to ask you to respond to this one, if that's okay.
Right, let me have a think about this. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Okay, so how do I involve my stakeholders? It's very important, of course, when you start a project like this to think about all your stakeholders, and that doesn't just include the teachers and the students. It's a wider picture. So there's your parents, of course, and then there's your teachers, there's your students, and then there's a community on a whole. So when we started our project, for instance, it was, of course, bringing in the entire school on board, and not, again, like I was saying, not just teachers, but also from an operational point of view, looking at the financial cost around it. So what does that mean in terms of making sure the strategy works over a 3-year long-term period or more? And then it doesn't just stop at 3 years. What happens after 3 years when you have to reinvest? So it was, of course, changing the mindset of, the operations director working with the financial team. But at the same time, what does that mean for teachers, of course, when you bring in this technology? What I'm trying to say here is that it went beyond. It also went into the parenting side of things, because we're now putting a device into the children's hand who are going to take it home and then use that same tools at home. And one of the biggest resistance was it could have been the parents. And of course, we did have some very difficult conversations. But I think a lot of time spent with them, including them in our decision process, not so much, but including them in why we're doing what we're doing, the sort of tools we're going to use for the children. That was a big thing. And so bringing them on board was a win-win for us. It did take time. And of course, we've had bumps along the way, but you work with them individually as and when you need to. I'm not sure if I've answered the question as best as I wanted to, because I perhaps left a few bits out, but that's where I'm going with this. It's a big picture, and in order to make sure that it moves along smoothly, you've got to include all your stakeholders, as I've mentioned.
Abid, I'd be really interested in your perspective here, just because one of the things that I've seen go wrong in schools is actually where the kind of interaction between those who are leading teaching and learning and those on the more technical side isn't as good as it could be, and actually getting your technical team on side and getting your teachers on side is really important. How have you found that works best, Abid?
From a technical perspective or from an IT professional perspective, if I should put it more better, is where I think the barriers have always been put up because IT professionals wouldn't understand teachers, and teachers wouldn't understand IT professionals. So IT professionals are thinking that they're doing the best thing to implement a secure IT network and systems, and teachers are just looking and saying, I just want to get onto YouTube, and you're not letting me. And I think definitely sitting down and starting to understand and appreciate from the sake of both parties. I think, you know, I've sat with so many IT managers over the years who are just like, oh, you know, I hate it. The teachers hate me, and I hate the teachers, and they never listen, and you know, they never do things properly, just make my life difficult. And you know, I said, well, you know, we're never going to get out of this rut if we don't try to understand what happens. And I say, especially in terms of winning over IT managers and technical teams, it's about, you know, the reason we're there is for the teaching and learning. It's a school. You know, if we're not there to support the school, then we're in the wrong industry. And I think that's where I think we had the success in winning over strategy with from both parties, because I go to loads and loads of conferences where I'm surrounded by great teachers who are doing great things, who turn around and say, you know, my IT teams never listen. And I felt like I was in a reverse approach, where I was kind of trying to push the strategy in my school, and the teachers just wanted to stay with the traditional approach. And I think just sitting down and opening that chain of conversation, and from a technical perspective, it's showing what's possible. And in order for me to be able to show what's possible to improve teaching and learning, I need to understand teaching and learning. And that would be my advice from technical perspective to IT professionals is definitely start to engage. Definitely, you know, people were quite shocked when I even knew what the word pedagogy meant, you know, and I think that's a huge start. That, you know, what is pedagogy? What is this buzzword that they keep talking about during those insets? And I think once you start to understand and appreciate where each party is coming from, what each party is trying to achieve, I think that's what definitely broke down the barriers towards the teaching and learning, and how we won over, or how I won over teaching. But then likewise, from the teacher's perspective, is try to understand what the IT professionals are trying to do, and why they're putting their reasoning for what challenges they're having in order to stop you from getting onto YouTube and onto other sites that you're trying to get onto.
Yeah, I think there was a few of us nodding and laughing as you were talking about that, having guiltily been on the side of the teacher who's going to the IT team. Well, why can't I just use this tool? Or why do you have to block that? Without maybe being quite as aware of there being very good reasons sometimes for that being the case. Thank you, Abid. That's great. Okay, I think we've got one last question. Dominic, I'd love to hear from you about how you can avoid, and this is interesting at a school trust level and an individual school level, I think, the implementation and communication of strategy being too top down rather than being something that your staff are really bought into.
So Abid said much of this just now, really. So we use something here in United Learning called the principle of subsidiarity, really, which is the starting point of which is the decision should be taken at the most effective level, as far down as possible. And that would mean, in terms of running schools, 99% of those decisions made at a school level, and therefore a really high bar being set by any other organisation, be it a MAT or a local authority or whatever, for trying to make a decision on behalf of schools. So we're very, very clear on that. And for that reason, I think there's probably 4 or 5 bits of software in use across the trust of the hundreds of pieces that are out there across our schools. So we effectively make certain that we don't implement from a top-down way. When there is the odd occasion, and it is quite rare, that everyone doing the same thing using the same tool just makes better sense than anything else, and probably things like management information system probably meets that test. Then you've got to make sure that you consult as widely as possible, and that you don't, when I say consult, that isn't a kind of lip service management of your stakeholders, but when you're identifying what does the management information system need to do, how are we going to procure it, which ones do we like, getting into those kind of detailed conversations with suppliers, that the room's full of people whose job it will be to use it in schools, and that the people from the centre are, proportionately represented. We're 2% of the population of our MAT, people who don't work in schools. So that's quite a good guide for, I think, the kind of decision-making weight that we should have.
I think there's a really interesting question, which we don't have time to go into now, but about how that runs down to a school level as well, that actually within a school, how much should be centrally purchased and used by all staff. Again, there will be some things that it will make absolute sense for that to be the case, and how much software use should come down to the decisions of individual subject departments, for example, in secondary schools. Are there things that are more appropriate to some or others? Obviously, there will be some subject-specific software, but there are also tools that we know might appeal quite differently, and there are huge advantages sometimes to coherence and consistency across school, but having flexibility where it's needed is also an interesting question. So that balance of autonomy and consistency is a challenge, I think, at every stage of education. Thank you very much to our panelists. I think we've just got one more slide to wrap up this evening. Which is just to briefly talk about Chartered College membership. I know lots of you who are on this webinar will already be members, but if you're not already a member of the Chartered College of Teaching, we have a huge range of things available to support you in the kinds of discussions that we've had today. It's $375 a month for membership, and you get access to our website, My College, which has all sorts of guides from teachers sharing their practice and summaries from researchers. It also gives you access to Impact, our journal, and in particular interest, I think, to people who've been on the webinar tonight will be our EdTech special issue of our journal, which came out earlier this year, all available online for you. Over 50 articles looking at how technology can be used to support teaching and learning, and contributions there from some of our panelists indeed. So that just leaves me to say a massive thank you to our panelists for joining us tonight. We'll obviously be making this recording available on the course so that people who weren't able to join us at this time will be able to participate and see what our panelists had to say. I've certainly really enjoyed hearing all of the expertise that we have. I think 4 of the most interesting people I've ever heard talk about technology. I've been privileged to have met all of you at some point. So a huge thank you. And if there are other questions that any of our joiners have tonight, then please do feel free to send those through, to pop them on the Padlet wall, or to, of course, discuss them during the step on the Future Learn course. Thank you very much, everyone.